The world before the salt was the first thing she noticed, not the fear, not the silence, not even the endless gray water stretching out in every direction like God had forgotten to put an edge on it. No, it was the salt on her lips, in her throat, in every breath she pulled into her tired lungs. Child, let me tell you something. There are moments in this life that split everything clean in two. Before and after. What happened to this woman? What she survived out there on that dark, indifferent ocean. That was her after. That was where her real story began. Her name was Maria. 53 years old, a fisherman's wife from a small coastal town, where the mornings smelled like engine oil and fresh catch, and the evenings were soft with the sound of waves against the dock. She had lived beside the ocean her whole life. Loved it, even. Trusted it the way you trust an old neighbor, familiar, mostly kind, occasionally unpredictable. Her husband, Carlos, had been taking his fishing boat out since he was 15 years old. He knew those waters, knew the patterns of the wind, knew when the sky was lying to him. People in town called him the safest man on the sea. That October morning when they set out together, just the two of them, a supply run to a small island trading post 2 days away. The sky was pale blue and calm. She packed a thin wool blanket because the nights had been getting cold. She packed a small photograph of her daughter tucked inside her coat pocket. Next to her heart, she did not pack for 47 days. Nobody does. The storm came on the second night. Not with warning. Not with the slow, dramatic buildup you see in the movies. It came the way real disaster always comes, fast, quiet at first, and then suddenly, terrifyingly loud. A wall of black water. The boat groaning. Carlos shouting something she couldn't hear over the roar of the wind. And then, silence. She woke up on the surface of the water, clinging to a piece of the wooden hull, coughing salt water from her lungs. It was still dark. The storm had passed as quickly as it came. And the boat was gone. Carlos was gone. Carried. I have lived long enough to know that some moments don't fully arrive all at once. The understanding comes slowly, like cold water rising around your ankles. She floated there in the dark, in the wreckage of her ordinary life. And the full weight of what had happened hadn't reached her yet. But it was coming, child. It was coming. She found a piece of the boat large enough to rest on, a wooden panel from the hull, maybe 6 feet long. She pulled herself onto it, shaking, soaking wet, and looked out at the water in every direction. There was nothing. No lights, no land, no land. No sound except the quiet lapping of the sea. And somewhere out there, under all that dark water, was the only life she had ever known. But that was not the worst part. Not even close that darkness the first day, she screamed. She screamed for Carlos. She screamed for Carlos. She screamed for help. She screamed until her voice cracked and disappeared into the enormous, uncaring sky. And the ocean didn't answer. It never does. By the second day, she had stopped screaming. Screaming uses energy. And energy, she was beginning to understand, was the only currency that mattered now. She had nothing in the and no food, no fresh water, one soaking wet wool blanket that had tangled around her legs in the water, and the photograph of her daughter, somehow still tucked inside her coat, somehow still dry. She had no idea what had happened to Carlos. That was the thought she kept pushing away, kept shoving into a dark corner of her mind, where she didn't have to look at it directly. Because if she looked at it directly, the sun on the first day was almost worse than the storm. It burned her face, her hands, the back of her neck. The ocean around her glittered and sparkled like something beautiful, which felt like a cruel joke. Beautiful things were not supposed to kill you. She drank nothing that first day. There was nothing to drink. On the second night, it rained. She lay flat on her wooden panel, face turned up to the sky, mouth open, letting the rain fall in. It tasted like nothing. Like the opposite of salt, like the most precious thing she had ever swallowed. She cupped her hands and caught what she could and drank until the rain stopped and she was left again in silence. What happened next? Nobody expected. She started to think clearly. Not with hope exactly. Hope felt too large, too dangerous. But with something smaller, something more precise. She began to think about the currents, about the shipping lanes Carlos had shown her on maps, about which direction the wind was coming from. She was not a navigator. She was a fisherman's wife. But she had been listening for 30 years. She used her blanket as a sail. She used her hands as paddles when the wind dropped. She talked to herself constantly, or to Carlos, or to God, or to her daughter. She wasn't always sure which. Some things you never forget. She told me she sang the same 3 songs over and over for 47 days. Old songs. Her mother's songs. The ones she hadn't thought about in years. By the second week, her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin had burned and peeled and burned again. She had lost track of the days. She counted them by the sunsets, scratching small marks into the wood of the hull with a bent nail she found in a crevice. By the 3rd week, she stopped counting. The truth was far darker than thirst, or hunger, or sunburn. The truth was the loneliness. Nobody in that ocean, in all that impossible emptiness, was prepared for what that kind of alone does to a person. It gets inside you. It starts to sound like a voice. It tells you things, terrible things. It tells you that the water is warmer than the air. That resting would be so easy. That nobody is coming, she told me. She argued back, out loud. Every single time, she argued back with the photograph in her coat pocket, with her daughter's face, with the memory of her kitchen at home, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of Carlos laughing at his own bad jokes. Was laughing at his own bad jokes. And then the storm came again, the second storm, worse than the first, and Maria held on to that wooden panel with both hands, in the dark, in the roaring wind, and she made herself a promise. She was going to make it home. Nobody in that moment knew if she could keep it. The survival on the 43rd day, she saw a bird. Just one. A seabird, gray and small, circling overhead. She watched it for a long time. In all those weeks, she had seen almost nothing alive. Just water, just sky, just the occasional fish breaking the surface in the distance. But birds don't fly far from land. Something shifted in her chest. Not hope. She had been careful with hope for 43 days. But something like the memory of hope. Something that said, not yet, not yet. She paddled with her hands, adjusted her blanket sail, kept moving toward where the bird had come from. On the 46th day, she smelled trees. She told me she cried for the first time in weeks, not from sadness, just from the smell of something alive and green and all that salt and emptiness. She cried and paddled and cried and paddled. On the 47th day, just before sunset, a cargo vessel spotted something floating in the water. A woman, on a piece of wood, barely conscious, sunburned beyond recognition, whispering something they couldn't quite hear. The ship's medic said later she was hours away from the end. Her body had given almost everything it had to give. Almost. They wrapped her in blankets. They gave her water in careful, small sips. They radioed ahead. They asked her name, and she told them. They asked her if she had family, and she said yes. One daughter, and she said yes. One daughter.